My son said, "Mom, sign these papers. It's just for your safety." The nurse slowly shook her head behind him.
Hi everyone, it's Grace. So glad to see you. How are you all doing? Let me know in the comments. Today we're diving into Dorothy's story, and let me tell you, it's a total masterclass in outsmarting a betrayal.
The pen felt heavier than it should have. One of those cheap ballpoints they keep in cups at reception desks, the kind that skips if you write too fast. Gerald had uncapped it for me already, like I couldn't manage that much on my own. He slid the papers across the administrator's desk with that smile he's been perfecting since he was 6 years old and wanted an extra cookie. "Just sign here, Mom, and here, and initial this page. It's all for your safety." Safety. That word again. He'd been throwing it around for weeks like confetti at a parade nobody wanted to attend. Behind him, near the door of the office, stood a young nurse I'd met earlier during the tour. Patrice, her name tag said. She had kind eyes and the sort of careful posture that comes from years of watching things she couldn't stop. When Gerald said safety, something flickered across her face. And then, so slowly that my son never noticed, she shook her head. Just once, left to right. A warning. I looked down at the papers. 12 pages of small print, the kind that makes your eyes swim if you're over 70 and forgot your reading glasses, which I hadn't forgotten, by the way. They were in my purse. I just didn't need them. I already knew what these papers said. I'd seen documents like these for 40 years, sliding across courtroom tables while sons and daughters pretended they were doing their parents a favor. I smiled at Gerald. My boy, my only child. The baby I walked the floors with when he had colic, the teenager I bailed out of trouble more times than I care to count. The man who stopped calling me Mom without wanting something, right around the time Reagan left office. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, "if it's for my safety." And I signed. Every page, every line. My signature looping across the paper like I hadn't a care in the world. Gerald practically deflated with relief. He was already pulling out his phone, probably texting Maureen that the old bird had finally caved. I watched his thumbs move across the screen. He didn't look at me. Why would he? The hard part was over. Mom had signed the papers. The house was as good as sold. The bank accounts would follow. What my son didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped paying attention to me as a person roughly 30 years ago, was that I'd made a phone call exactly 1 hour before we walked into this office. Margaret Chen, senior partner at Chen & Associates, specializing in elder law and what the courts politely call financial exploitation by family members. Margaret and I go way back, 40 years back. She was a young prosecutor when I was transcribing custody battles and inheritance fights in family court. We'd seen every dirty trick in the book together, and we'd invented a few of our own for catching the ones we hadn't seen yet. "Dottie," she'd said when I called, "I've been waiting for this call since I met your son at Frank's funeral. That boy has grifter written all over his face." So when Gerald handed me those papers, I signed them with a clear conscience. Because they weren't his papers anymore. Margaret had made sure of that. The documents in the administrator's folder, the ones Gerald thought would hand him control of my life, my house, my savings, had been swapped during what Gerald assumed was just a bathroom break for his old, tired mother. What I actually signed was a sworn affidavit documenting 3 years of financial exploitation, a revocation of the healthcare proxy. Gerald had tricked me into signing back when I was too grief-sick after Frank's death to read the fine print, and a formal complaint that was, at that very moment, making its way to the district attorney's Elder Abuse Task Force. Gerald tucked the folder under his arm like a trophy. He didn't read past the first page. He never reads past the first page. That's the thing about people who think they're smarter than everyone else. They stop paying attention to details. They assume the con is working because it always has before. "Thanks, Mom," he said, bending down to kiss my cheek. His lips were dry. "You're doing the right thing." "I know I am," I said. "I finally am." He didn't catch the emphasis. He was too busy thinking about commission percentages and property values and whatever it is my son thinks about when he's not thinking about me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. Let me tell you how my own boy tried to put me in a box and sell my life out from under me. 6 weeks before I sat in that administrator's office, Gerald showed up at my door unannounced. This was unusual enough to make me suspicious right from the start. My son doesn't visit. He schedules appointments, and even those he cancels half the time. But there he was on a Tuesday morning, Maureen trailing behind him with that pinched expression she always wears when she's pretending to care about something. "Mom," Gerald said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "We need to talk." Those 4 words have never preceded anything good in the history of the English language. I've heard them in courtrooms 1,000 times, usually right before someone's life got turned inside out. I led them to the living room, the same living room where Gerald took his first steps, where Frank and I used to dance to the radio when we thought nobody was watching, where I'd been sitting alone for 12 years since my husband died, and my son decided I was more useful as a source of funds than as a mother. "We've been talking," Gerald said, settling onto my couch like he owned it. Maybe in his mind he already did. "And we're worried about you." Worried. Another word he'd been wearing out lately. Gerald worried about me the way a farmer worries about a cow that's stopped producing milk. Not out of affection, but out of concern for what he might lose. Maureen was wandering around the room with her phone out, not even trying to hide it, taking pictures of the crown molding, the built-in bookshelves Frank had installed himself, the bay window that looked out over the garden I'd been tending for 43 years. I watched her open the closet door in the hallway, peer inside, take another photo. "The house is too big for you," Gerald continued. "The stairs are dangerous. You're 77, Mom. What if you fall?" "I haven't fallen," I said. "Yet." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, doing his concerned son impression. "And what about the gas bill? You forgot to pay it last month. What if they'd shut off your heat?" Now that was interesting. Because I hadn't forgotten to pay the gas bill. I'd been paying my bills on time since before Gerald was born. What I had discovered 3 days earlier was that my mail had been getting forwarded to Gerald's address for the past 3 months. He'd arranged it himself. So if any bills went unpaid, it was because he was holding them hostage. I didn't say any of this. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, looking like the confused old woman he wanted me to be. "Doctor Patterson recommended we look into assisted living options," Gerald said. "She thinks it would be safer for you, more social. You're isolated here, Mom." I've known Ellen Patterson for 30 years. She delivered Gerald, for God's sake. Ellen would have called me directly if she had concerns. She would have come to my house with a pot of soup and sat at this very table and talked to me like a human being. She would not have sent my son as a messenger. Another lie. Gerald was stacking them up like cordwood, and he had no idea I was counting every single one. Maureen came back from her tour of my home, phone tucked into her pocket now, a satisfied look on her face. She sat down next to Gerald and put her hand on his arm. "We just want what's best for you, Dorothy," she said. "My daughter-in-law has never called me anything but Dorothy. Never Mom, never Dot, never even Mrs. Brennan. Just Dorothy, like I'm a stranger she's been forced to make small talk with at a party. "We've found a lovely place," Gerald added. "Maplewood Senior Living, very modern. They have activities, a dining hall, nurses on staff around the clock. You'd have your own room." "One room," I said quietly. "A nice room. Private bathroom. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or repairs or any of that. And this house," he gestured around at the walls that held 60 years of my life. "This house could go to someone who'd really use it." There it was, the real point, finally swimming to the surface like a fish that couldn't stay underwater any longer. Gerald leaned toward me and reached for the hearing aids I've worn for almost 20 years now. "Here, Mom, let me turn these down so you can rest your ears. I know they get tiring." He's been doing this for years, turning off my hearing aids during important conversations. He thinks it makes me easier to manage, more pliable, less likely to argue. What he doesn't know, what he's never bothered to find out, is that I learned to read lips decades ago when my hearing first started to go. I can follow a conversation across a crowded room if I need to. I just never told him. Let a man think he has an advantage, and he'll show you exactly who he is. With my hearing aids off, Gerald and Maureen retreated to my kitchen. I sat in my chair like a good, obedient mother, watching them through the doorway. They thought I couldn't hear them. They were wrong. I watched Maureen's lips move. She won't fight it. She's too old, too tired. And Gerald's response, "Just get the papers ready. I'll have her signature by the end of the month." I sat very still in my living room, in the house my husband built with his own hands, and I thought, "You stupid, stupid boy. I raised you. I changed your diapers. I know exactly how you lie. The way your left eye twitches, the way you scratch your neck, the way you won't look directly at whoever you're deceiving. I taught you to tie your shoes. I held your hand on your first day of school. And now you're sitting in my kitchen, planning to steal everything I have. 40 years in family court taught me many things. The most important one was this: when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time." I just wish I'd taken that advice with my own son. Let me go back further, because a betrayal like this doesn't spring up overnight. It grows in the dark, feeding on years of small surrenders and unanswered questions. My husband Frank died 12 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, quick and brutal, the way he would have wanted to go if he'd had any say in it. He was a carpenter by trade, a reader of history books by passion, and the only man I ever loved. We met in 1969 at a church social I didn't want to attend. He asked me to dance even though he had 2 left feet, and I said yes, even though I hated dancing. We were married for 47 years. The last thing he said to me was, "Don't let Gerald push you around." I should have listened. After the funeral, Gerald swooped in to help with the finances. I was drowning in grief, barely able to get out of bed in the morning, and my son appeared with spreadsheets and a sympathetic expression. He moved money around, consolidated accounts, set up automatic transfers. "To make things easier for you, Mom." I didn't ask questions. I should have asked questions. But when you're 75 and you've just buried the man you built your whole life with, you don't have the energy to suspect your own child. Looking back, the signs were all there. Gerald added himself to my bank accounts for emergencies. He convinced me to sign a healthcare proxy in case something happens and decisions need to be made quickly. He suggested I put the house in both our names to avoid probate later. Every request came wrapped in concern, tied with the ribbon of, "I just want to protect you, Mom." I signed everything. God help me, I signed everything he put in front of me. And then things started to disappear. Not big things, not at first. Just small amounts from my savings that Gerald explained away as fees and transfers and investments. The returns never materialized. The fees kept growing, but I still had enough to live on, so I didn't dig deeper. I didn't want to believe what my gut was already telling me. The truth is, Gerald has been taking from me his whole life. I just chose not to add it up. I paid for his first apartment when he was 22 and couldn't make rent. I paid for his wedding to his first wife, Candace, a sweet girl he treated terribly until she finally had the sense to leave him. I paid for his divorce from Candace. I paid for his wedding to Maureen. I paid the down payment on their house when his credit was too damaged from all those investments that never paid off. I gave him money when his car broke down, when his business failed, when Maureen wanted to renovate the kitchen, when the kids needed braces, when the roof started leaking. Every time he called, there was a new crisis, a new emergency, a new reason why he needed just a little more, and every time I wrote the check. Because that's what mothers do. Because I remembered the little boy who brought me dandelions from the backyard and called them roses. Because I kept hoping, stupidly, that this time would be the last time, that he would finally get on his feet, that he would call one day just to ask how I was doing. He never did. I kept a mental count after a while. The last time Gerald called me without asking for money was at Frank's funeral. 12 years. The last time he visited without an agenda was even longer. The last time he called me Mom in a way that sounded like he meant it, like I was his mother and not just a bank account with a pulse, was sometime during the Reagan administration. I'm not exaggerating. I've had a lot of time to think about this. But hope is a stupid, stubborn thing. It latches onto your heart and won't let go, even when every piece of evidence tells you to stop. I kept hoping my son would change. I kept hoping the little boy I raised was still in there somewhere. I kept hoping that love meant something, even when he proved over and over that it didn't. 40 years in family court, and I still couldn't see the con happening in my own house. Or maybe I could see it. Maybe I just didn't want to look. The pressure campaign started 3 weeks before that day in the administrator's office. Gerald began calling every day, sometimes twice. Always with articles he'd come across about elderly falls, home invasions in our neighborhood, heating systems that failed in the middle of winter. "I just want you to be informed, Mom," he'd say. "I just want you to understand the risks." He mentioned Margaret Hoffman, my neighbor down the street. "You know she died alone, right? They didn't find her for 4 days. 4 days, Mom. Is that what you want?" Margaret Hoffman moved to Florida last spring. I saw her at the supermarket 2 weeks ago, tanned and healthy, buying oranges and complaining about her son-in-law. But Gerald didn't know that. Gerald assumed I didn't talk to anyone, didn't leave the house, didn't have any way to check his lies. Maureen started showing up every few days to help clean. She'd bustle around with a mop and a bucket, making a big show of how exhausting it was to take care of this huge old house. Really, she was inventorying. I noticed her opening drawers, looking in closets, checking labels on things. One morning, after she left, I moved the couch to vacuum behind it, and I found a sticky note on the back of my grandmother's armchair. In Maureen's handwriting, A-N-T, chair. $400? I checked the rest of my furniture. The dining set. Frank and I bought for our 10th anniversary. Table plus 6 chairs, $1,200. The oak bookshelf from my father's study, BKSHF oak, $600. The grandfather clock that had been in Frank's family for 3 generations. CLK needs work. $350. My home had been priced for sale while I was still living in it. I peeled off every sticky note, one by one, and put them in a box. Then I put the box in the closet, behind my winter coats, where Maureen had already looked and wouldn't look again. Evidence. Another thing 40 years in court had taught me. Keep everything. Write down everything. You never know what will matter later. But the real turning point came on a Thursday afternoon, when Denise, my mail carrier, knocked on my door instead of just leaving the letters in the box. Denise is young, maybe 30, with braids she wears pinned up while she's working. I've been giving her Christmas cookies every December for 5 years. She's one of those people who actually sees the elderly folks on her route, who knows our names and our habits and notices when something seems off. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, looking uncomfortable, "I'm not supposed to do this, but I've been seeing your mail go to a different address for a few months now, and it didn't feel right, so I pulled these out before they got forwarded." She handed me a stack of envelopes, bank statements I'd never received, a notice about a lien on my property I didn't authorize, medical bills that should have gone to my insurance but instead had been left unpaid, piling up interest. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter from a real estate developer making an unsolicited offer on my house. A very generous offer. The kind of offer that makes you suspicious immediately. The letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Gerald. I stood in my doorway, 77 years old, holding the proof that my son was selling my house out from under me. The house Frank built. The house where I raised my child. The house where I thought I would die, in my own bed. Surrounded by my own things. On my own terms. I thanked Denise. I'm not sure what I said exactly. The next few minutes are fuzzy in my memory. I know I closed the door. I know I sat down at the kitchen table and spread out all those papers. I know I read every single word, even when the words started to blur. The game was bigger than I'd thought. This wasn't just about selling the house. This was about a conservatorship. I'd seen hundreds of conservatorship cases in family court. Good ones, where a sick or incapacitated person genuinely needed someone to make decisions for them. And bad ones, where greedy relatives used the courts to steal everything from people who were perfectly capable of managing their own affairs. The papers Gerald wanted me to sign would make him my legal guardian, my conservator, the person in charge of my finances, my health care, my living situation. Once I signed, I would own nothing. Not my house, not my savings, not even the right to decide where I lived or what doctor I saw. I would become, legally, no more capable than a child. My son would control everything. And given what I'd already learned about where my money had been going, I had no doubt where the rest of it would end up. I sat at that table until the sun went down and the kitchen got dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't eat dinner. I just sat there, looking at my hands, and for the first time in 40 years, they wouldn't stop shaking. You'd think, finding something like that out, a person would cry, or scream, or throw things. I've seen all those reactions in my years behind the stenographer's desk. I've watched families tear themselves apart in courtrooms, all that grief and rage pouring out like water from a broken pipe. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went very quiet, the way I learned to go quiet all those years taking down testimony. When you're recording someone's words, you can't have reactions. You can't gasp or sigh, or let your feelings show on your face. You just keep your fingers moving and your expression neutral, no matter what horrors you're hearing. Gerald mistook my quiet for surrender. He always has. When I stop arguing, he thinks he's won. He doesn't understand that silence, for me, is the sound of thinking, planning, preparing. The next morning, I made a list. First, call Margaret Chen. She'd given me her card at Frank's funeral, along with a hug and a whispered warning I hadn't understood at the time. If you ever need help, Dottie, any kind of help, you call me. Now I understood. Second, call Dr. Patterson. I needed to know exactly what Gerald had told her, and more importantly, what she actually thought about my mental state. Third, call the bank. Find out exactly how much money had moved and where it had gone. Fourth, find my old stenographer's notebook, the one I kept personal notes in, not transcripts. Gerald never learned shorthand. Most people never do anymore. Which meant I could write anything I wanted in that notebook, and even if he found it, he wouldn't be able to read it. I started with Margaret. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. Senior partners usually have assistants screening their calls, but she picked up herself, and when she heard my voice, she said, "Dottie, tell me everything." So I did. The mail forwarding, the bank accounts, the sticky notes on my furniture, the healthcare proxy I'd signed without reading, the conservatorship papers Gerald was trying to get me to sign. "That son of a bitch," Margaret said when I finished. She's always had a mouth on her. It's one of the things I like about her. I knew it. I knew it at the funeral. The way he was looking around the house, pricing things with his eyes. I wanted to say something, but it wasn't your place, I finished. I know. I wouldn't have listened anyway. You're listening now. I'm listening now, I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to play along. Let him think you're going to sign. Let him think he's won. Meanwhile, I'll file motions to freeze the joint accounts and void the healthcare proxy, and I'm going to call in a favor from the DA's office." The DA? Elder Abuse Task Force. What your son is doing isn't just unethical, Dottie. It's criminal. We're going to document everything, build a case, and when he walks into whatever signing ceremony he's planning, we're going to be there waiting. My heart was beating too fast. I could feel it pounding in my throat. What if it doesn't work? What if he... "It will work," Margaret said. "You spent 40 years watching people try to pull this exact scam. You know how it goes. The ones who get caught are the ones who think they're smarter than everyone else. Your son thinks you're old and confused and helpless. He's wrong on all 3 counts. We're going to use that." I closed my eyes. The shaking in my hands had stopped. In its place was something else, something colder and more focused. "Tell me what to do," I said. "For now, nothing. Act tired. Act forgetful. Let Gerald think his plan is working. I'll handle the rest." "Margaret," I said, "why are you helping me? We haven't spoken in years." She laughed. "Because you taught me half of what I know about how these cases really work. Because you were the only person in that courthouse who treated me like a colleague instead of a secretary. And because I've been itching to nail a case like this for a long time." She paused. "Also, I really hate your son." "That makes 2 of us," I said. And for the first time since I'd found those forwarded letters, something like a smile crossed my face. My second call was to Dr. Patterson. Ellen answered at her office, and when I told her what Gerald had claimed, that she'd recommended assisted living, that she thought I was declining, she went so quiet I thought the line had gone dead. "Dorothy," she said finally, "I never said any of that. I haven't recommended anything to Gerald because Gerald has never asked me anything about your care. He hasn't called this office in over 2 years." "I didn't think so," I said. "Are you telling me he's using my name to pressure you into something?" "Into a conservatorship. He wants control of my assets. Ellen made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then, over my dead body. I'll write a letter today documenting your current cognitive status. You're sharper than half my patient's 20 years younger. If he tries to claim you're incompetent, he's going to have to get through me first. Thank you, Ellen. Don't thank me. Just don't sign anything without a lawyer present. And if you need a medical evaluation for court, you call me. I'll clear my schedule. I hung up, feeling steadier. That's 2 people who see me clearly, 2 people who know Gerald is lying, 2 people who will stand up in court if it comes to that. The third call was hardest. I've never liked dealing with banks. All those automated menus and hold music and chipper customer service voices asking how they can provide an excellent experience today. But I got through eventually to a supervisor who had access to the records I needed. The numbers were worse than I'd feared. Over the past 3 years, Gerald had transferred just under $180,000 out of accounts I thought were mine alone. The transfers had been small at first, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, escalating over time as he realized I wasn't checking the statements, or rather, as he made sure I couldn't check them by forwarding my mail to his own address. $180,000. 3 decades of savings, careful planning, Frank's pension, gone into accounts I couldn't access, investments I couldn't find, a black hole of my son's greed. The supervisor was sympathetic but couldn't do much. Gerald was on the accounts. The transfers were technically legal. You could file a dispute, she offered, but with a family member involved, these things usually end up in civil court. I understand, I said. Can you send me documentation of all the transfers? Everything from the past 5 years. Of course. It'll take a few days. That's fine. I'm not going anywhere. When I hung up, I sat for a while in my quiet kitchen, looking at the stack of papers I'd already accumulated. The forwarded mail, the sticky notes, the letter to Gerald about my house, Dr. Patterson's number and her promise to testify, Margaret's instructions for the case she was building. Then I went to the hall closet and dug out a box I hadn't opened in years. Old office supplies mostly, pens that had dried out, notepads from conferences I'd forgotten, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded rubber band, my stenographer's notebook. The cover was green, worn soft at the corners. I'd bought it in 1978 and never quite finished filling it. The last entry was from 1996. Notes on a case involving a daughter who'd faked her mother's signature on a trust amendment. The mother had been 92. The daughter had been sure no one would believe the senile old woman over her. She'd been wrong. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened to a fresh page. My hand remembered the shorthand symbols, like an old song, the loops and lines and curves that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't learned the system. I wrote down everything, dates, amounts, conversations. Lies Gerald had told, with timestamps for when I'd heard them, the sticky notes and where I'd found them, the mail forwarding and when I'd discovered it. Every piece of evidence, every suspicion, every moment when I'd noticed something wrong and talked myself out of acting. Documentation is everything. Memory can be questioned in court. Paper cannot. I worked until my hand cramped and the light through the window shifted from afternoon gold to evening gray. When I finally stopped, I had 12 pages of notes in shorthand. My son couldn't read if his life depended on it. Then I hid the notebook in the same place I'd hidden the sticky notes, behind my winter coats, in the closet Maureen had already searched. Let Gerald think he's winning. Let him believe I'm just a confused old woman he can push around. I've been underestimated by smarter men than him. The next 2 weeks were a performance, maybe the best performance of my life. Gerald called every day, And I answered. I let my voice waver. I repeated myself. I asked him the same questions twice. I told him I was tired. So tired. And maybe he was right. Maybe the house was too big. "You're making the right decision, Mom," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "We just want to take care of you." Take care of me. Like putting down an old dog. Like closing up a summer house for the winter. Maureen came by twice more to help clean, and I let her. I even asked her questions about Maplewood Senior Living, pretending I'd looked it up online and thought it seemed nice. She practically glowed with victory. "You'll love it there," she said. "The gardens are beautiful. And you'll have so much company." "Company would be nice," I agreed, shuffling past her like my joints hurt more than they did. They hurt plenty, don't get me wrong. 77 years will do that to a body. But I can still move when I need to. I just made sure she didn't see it. Meanwhile, Margaret was working. I got updates in the evenings, phone calls when Gerald wasn't likely to drop by. "The accounts are frozen," she told me 4 days in. "Temporary order while we investigate." He won't be able to move anything else. Will he know? He'll know eventually, but by the time he figures it out, we'll have the rest in place. The rest meant the DA's office. Margaret had contacts there. A young prosecutor named William Hayes, who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. He'd reviewed my documentation and called it a textbook case of undue influence and financial exploitation. He wanted to meet with me, record a statement, prepare for what would happen when Gerald realized his plan wasn't going to work. "He's going to be angry," I said to Margaret one evening, "when he finds out." "Probably. Does that scare you?" I thought about it. My son, with his temper and his entitlement, and his belief that everything I owned was really his. "A little," I admitted, "but not enough to stop." "Good, because we're almost ready. He's scheduled that signing for Friday, right? At Maplewood? 3 o'clock. Perfect. I'll be there. William will be outside with the paperwork. And Dottie," she paused, "I have one more piece of the puzzle for you." "What's that?" "The nurse on Gerald's tour at Maplewood, Patrice. She's my niece." I nearly dropped the phone. "Your niece?" "She's been working there for 2 years. Good kid, sharp eyes. When she heard your name on the schedule, she called me, asked if it was the Dorothy Brennan I used to work with. I told her to keep an eye out. To let you know, if she could, that you weren't alone in that room." A slow warmth spread through my chest. Not the false warmth of Gerald's promises, but something real. The warmth of being seen, being believed, being part of something larger than my own small fight. "Tell her thank you," I said, "from me. You can tell her yourself on Friday. Now get some rest. The hard part's coming." The day before the signing, Gerald came to take me to what he called a pre-visit at Maplewood. He wanted me to see the room they'd picked out, to meet some of the staff, to feel comfortable and prepared. What he really wanted was to soften me up, to make sure I didn't have second thoughts at the last minute. He'd underestimated me for so long that it never occurred to him I might be planning something of my own. Maplewood Senior Living was exactly what you'd expect. Clean hallways that smelled like industrial floor cleaner and something floral trying to mask it. Cheerful staff in color-coded scrubs. A common room with puzzles on the tables and a television playing some game show at low volume. Old people in wheelchairs, old people with walkers, old people sitting alone by the windows, watching the parking lot like they were waiting for someone who was never going to come. It wasn't a bad place. I've seen worse in my years following guardianship cases through the courts. But it wasn't home. It wasn't my house, my garden, my bed, my things. It was a place to wait out the clock, and I wasn't ready to stop living yet. Gerald steered me through the tour with his hand on my elbow, gripping just a little too tight. He introduced me to the administrator, a trim woman in her 50s named Barbara, who smiled a lot and used words like community and support and peace of mind. He showed me the room they'd selected. Small, clean, impersonal, a bed, a dresser, a window looking out on the back garden. Room for a few photographs, maybe a favorite chair. "Isn't it nice, Mom?" he said, squeezing my arm. "Very nice," I murmured. I made myself look around slowly, touch the curtains, peer into the tiny bathroom, playing my part. That's when I saw Patrice for the first time. She was in the hallway, adjusting an IV stand, but her eyes were on me. When our gazes met, she gave the smallest nod, barely more than a blink. Recognition. Solidarity. Margaret's niece. Watching out for me. I nodded back, just as subtly, and turned away before Gerald could notice. On our way out, Gerald stopped to shake hands with Barbara and confirm the appointment tomorrow. Patrice passed behind him, so close I could have touched her arm. "You don't have to sign anything," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "Legally, they can't make you." Gerald heard something. He turned, frowning. "What was that?" "I asked if Mrs. Brennan needed anything," Patrice said smoothly. "Water, maybe?" "The tour can be tiring." "She's fine," Gerald said, dismissing her without a second look. Patrice retreated, her face professionally blank. But her eyes, for just a moment, met mine again. "You are not alone," they said. "I know," I answered silently. "I know. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from fear. Not exactly. It was more like the feeling I used to get before a big trial. That buzzing alertness, the mind running through possibilities and contingencies, the body restless with stored-up energy. I got out of bed around midnight and walked through my house. Every room held a memory. The kitchen where I taught Gerald to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. The living room where Frank proposed to me, kneeling on a rug we still have. The bedroom where we made love and fought and made up again, year after year, until death finally separated us. Gerald wanted to sell all of this. Not for me, for himself. To feed whatever hunger drove him, whatever emptiness he'd never been able to fill, no matter how much he took. I stopped in front of our wedding photo on the mantel, Frank in his rented suit, me in the dress my mother had altered to fit. We looked so young, so hopeful. We had no idea what was coming. The hard years and the good years, the disappointments and the joys, the child who would grow up to betray us both. I turned the photo over, checking. But there was no sticky note. Maureen must have missed this one. Then I saw it. On the back of the frame, in pencil, so faint I almost didn't notice, a notation in Maureen's handwriting. FR. $50? FR. Frame. $50 for the silver frame that held my wedding photo. The frame Frank bought at an antique shop on our 15th anniversary because I'd mentioned wanting one someday. They had priced it. They had priced my wedding photo. I set the frame down carefully. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The buzzing in my chest had gone cold and still. Tomorrow, I would sign the papers. Just not the papers Gerald expected. And then my son would learn what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent 40 years watching families destroy themselves in courtrooms. Friday afternoon arrived gray and damp, the sky pressing down like a lid on a pot. Gerald picked me up at 2 o'clock, fussing about whether I had my purse, my keys, my reading glasses. Always the performance of concern, even now. "Big day, Mom," he said as we drove to Maplewood. "After this, you won't have to worry about anything anymore." "That's what I'm counting on," I said. He glanced at me, something flickering in his eyes. Suspicion? No, just satisfaction. He thought he'd won. He thought I was beaten. We pulled into the parking lot at 2:45. Gerald helped me out of the car with exaggerated care, like I might shatter if he moved too fast. I leaned on his arm and shuffled toward the entrance, playing my part one last time. Patrice was at the reception desk when we walked in. She smiled at Gerald with professional warmth and directed us toward Barbara's office. "Mrs. Brennan," she added, "can I get you some water? It's a warm day." "That would be lovely," I said. Gerald frowned. "We don't have time for—" "It'll just be a moment," Patrice said, already stepping away. "I'll bring it to the office." We continued down the hall, Gerald's grip on my elbow tightening. Barbara's office was at the end, the door already open, the administrator rising to greet us with that practiced smile. "Mrs. Brennan, so good to see you again. Please, come in, sit down." The office was small, efficient, decorated with certificates on the walls and a few framed photographs of grandchildren. A stack of papers sat on the desk, neatly arranged. The papers? Gerald's papers. Or so he thought. He settled me into a chair and took the seat beside me, pulling his phone out of his pocket to check messages. Barbara made small talk about the weather, the community events planned for the weekend, the lovely room waiting for me. I nodded and smiled and said nothing important. Then Patrice arrived with a glass of water. She set it beside me, and as she straightened, her hand brushed mine. A tiny squeeze, almost imperceptible. "Thank you, dear," I said. She moved to stand near the door, unobtrusive, watching. Just another staff member, present in case the resident needed anything. Barbara pulled the papers across the desk. "Now, Mrs. Brennan, these are the documents we discussed: admission agreement, healthcare consent, financial arrangements." She tapped each section as she named it. "Your son has already reviewed everything. It's all standard." Standard. Like Gerald's just a formality. Like Maureen's, "We just want what's best for you." All those soft words wrapping an iron fist. Gerald uncapped a pen, the cheap ballpoint from Barbara's desk cup, and slid it toward me. "Just sign here, Mom, and here, and initial this page. It's all for your safety." I looked at the papers, then at my son, then at Patrice, standing near the door with her careful, watching eyes. Behind Gerald, Patrice slowly shook her head. Left to right. One small motion. I picked up the pen. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "If it's for my safety." And I signed. Every page. Every line. My signature looping across the paper like I hadn't a care in the world. Gerald exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for weeks. "Thanks, Mom," he said, already reaching for the folder. "You're doing the right thing." "I know," I said. "I finally am." He tucked the papers under his arm and stood, pulling out his phone to text Maureen the good news. Barbara was already talking about move-in dates and what I should bring, what would be provided. Patrice remained by the door, her face professionally neutral, and then the door opened and Margaret Chen walked in. She looked exactly as I remembered. Sharp-eyed, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Gerald's monthly car payment. Behind her came a man I didn't recognize, tall and solemn, carrying a briefcase. Sorry to interrupt, Margaret said, not sounding sorry at all. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind. I wanted to be here for the signing. Gerald's face went pale. Who the hell are you? Margaret Chen. I'm Dorothy's attorney. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And this is William Hayes from the District Attorney's Elder Abuse Task Force. The room went very still. Barbara looked confused. Gerald looked like someone had dumped ice water down his back. What is this? He demanded. Mom, what's going on? I folded my hands in my lap and looked at my son. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time since he was a little boy bringing me dandelions. Open the folder, Gerald, I said quietly. What? The folder. The papers I just signed. Open it. He looked down at the folder under his arm like it had suddenly grown teeth. Then, slowly, he flipped it open and pulled out the top page. I watched his expression change as he read. First confusion, then denial, then, finally, understanding. And fear. This isn't... He flipped to the next page, then the next. These aren't the right papers. Mom, what did you do? I signed a sworn affidavit documenting 3 years of financial exploitation, I said. I revoked the healthcare proxy you tricked me into signing after your father's funeral. And I filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. William Hayes stepped forward. Gerald Brennan? We have some questions about transfers totaling approximately $180,000 from your mother's accounts over the past 3 years. Gerald's face went from white to red to something approaching purple. Mom, he sputtered. Mom, what did you do? I looked at my son, my only child, my baby, the man who had decided I was worth more to him as a bank account than as a mother, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not triumph. Just a cold, clear certainty that I was finally doing what needed to be done. I paid attention, I said. That's all. I just finally paid attention. The next hour was chaos. Gerald demanded to see the original papers, the ones he thought I'd signed. Barbara, confused and frightened, produced them from her desk drawer. She'd had no idea about the switch, had simply been given a new folder that morning by a representative from Mrs. Brennan's legal team. Margaret had planned everything. The switch, the timing, the presence of witnesses. William Hayes read Gerald his rights while my son stood there sputtering about misunderstandings and family matters and how none of this was what it looked like. It was exactly what it looked like. That was the problem. Patrice stood beside me through all of it, a quiet, steady presence. At one point, she brought me another glass of water and whispered, My aunt said you were something special. She wasn't wrong. Your aunt taught me half of what I know, I said. I'm just glad I remembered it in time. Gerald was not arrested that day. White-collar crimes take time to prosecute, especially when they involve family members and complicated financial records. But he was informed that an investigation was underway, that his access to my accounts had been frozen, and that any attempt to contact me or pressure me in any way would be considered witness tampering. He tried anyway, of course. On his way out of the office, escorted by William Hayes, he stopped in front of my chair and leaned down until his face was inches from mine. You're going to regret this, he hissed. You're going to die alone in that house, and nobody is going to care.
Can you imagine a son saying that to his mother's face? Honestly, if you were in Dorothy's shoes and your child said this to you after you spent your whole life raising them, what would be your immediate comeback? I'm dying to see your answers in the comments because this is just cold-blooded.
I looked up at my son, my boy, the child I had loved and fed and clothed and paid for over and over, hoping each time that this would be when he finally became the man I'd raised him to be. "I've been alone for 12 years, I said. "Ever since your father died and you started treating me like an obstacle to your inheritance. At least now I'll be alone in my own house, making my own decisions, with my own money in my own accounts." I paused. "And Gerald? That woman you married has been pricing my furniture for months. You might want to check what she's planning to do with yours." His face twisted. For a moment I thought he might actually hit me, but William Hayes took his arm and steered him toward the door. And then he was gone, and the office was quiet. Margaret sat down in the chair Gerald had vacated. "You okay, Dottie?" I considered the question. My son had just been marched out of a nursing home under suspicion of stealing from his own mother. My life for the next year would be consumed by legal proceedings and depositions and court dates. My relationship with my only child was almost certainly over. "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it. The drive home was quiet. Margaret had offered to take me herself, but I'd asked her to call a taxi instead. I needed the silence, the anonymity, the chance to sit in the back of a stranger's car and watch my town slide past the windows. The house was dark when I arrived. I'd left in such a hurry that I'd forgotten to turn on the porch light. But the key was still in the planter, and the lock still turned. And when I stepped inside, the familiar smell of home wrapped around me like an old blanket. I walked through each room, turning on lights as I went. The kitchen, the living room, the bedroom where Frank and I had slept for 47 years. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The furniture Gerald and Maureen had priced for sale. The photographs they'd considered getting rid of. My life, still here, still mine. I stopped in front of our wedding photo. Frank smiled at me from across the decades, young and hopeful and utterly unaware of how his son would turn out. "I did it," I told him. I finally stood up. He didn't answer, of course, but I like to think he would have been proud. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair, looking out at the garden Frank had planted the year after we moved in. The roses needed pruning. The hedge had grown wild. There was work to be done, and I wasn't sure I had the energy to do it all. But I had time. That was the thing. I had time, and I had my house, and I had my own 2 hands to shape whatever was left of my life. Tomorrow I would call a gardener. Tomorrow I would start sorting through the paperwork. Tomorrow I would begin the long, slow process of rebuilding what my son had tried to tear down. Tonight, I just sat and breathed and let myself be still. The weeks that followed were harder than I'd expected, but not in the ways I'd feared. Gerald didn't come back. Maureen filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the incident. Apparently, she'd been planning it anyway, just waiting until Gerald secured my assets to make her exit. The house they'd bought with my down payment went on the market. Their children, my grandchildren, stopped speaking to both of them. The grandchildren. That was the part that hurt most. There were 3 of them. Tyler, who was 24 and working in sales somewhere in Colorado. Madison, 21 and still in college. And little Emma, who wasn't so little anymore at 17. I'd seen them grow up in photographs and brief holiday visits, always chaperoned by Gerald and Maureen, always cut short when the kids started asking me questions their parents didn't want answered. I didn't know if they blamed me for what happened. I didn't know if Gerald had told them his version of the story, painted me as a vindictive old woman who'd ruined their father's life. I didn't know anything, because they hadn't called, and I didn't know if calling them would make things better or worse. Margaret advised me to wait. "Let the dust settle," she said. "They're adults, or nearly so. They'll come to their own conclusions." So I waited. I'm good at waiting. 40 years as a court stenographer taught me that most of life is waiting. For testimony to resume, for judges to rule, for verdicts to come in. You learn patience, or you learn to go crazy. I chose patience. The investigation into Gerald's finances moved slowly, the way these things always do. William Hayes kept me updated with occasional phone calls, professional and careful. They'd found more irregularities than they'd first expected. The $180,000 was just the beginning. There were credit cards in my name I'd never applied for. A second mortgage on my house that had somehow been processed without my signature, or with a signature someone had forged. Business loans guaranteed by assets I didn't know Gerald had access to. The total, when they finished adding it up, was closer to $300,000. My entire retirement savings, Frank's pension, the nest egg we'd spent our whole lives building, gone into my son's pockets and out again into failed investments and bad decisions and a lifestyle he couldn't afford. "Will I get any of it back?" I asked William once. He hesitated. "Some, probably. There's restitution built into most plea deals for cases like this, but the money's largely spent. You can't squeeze blood from a stone." I nodded. I'd expected as much. The money was gone, and no amount of legal proceedings would bring it back. What I'd saved wasn't money. It was my house, my independence, my right to make my own decisions. That was worth more than any dollar amount. Still, I'd be lying if I said the numbers didn't sting. All those years of being careful. All those envelopes in the back of the drawer marked someday. All gone, because I trusted my own son. Spring came late that year. I spent April watching the garden through my window, waiting for the ground to thaw enough to work. Margaret sent over a landscaping company she knew, young men who were polite and efficient and didn't treat me like I might break if they spoke too loudly. They cleared out the dead growth from winter, pruned Frank's roses, edged the beds I'd been neglecting for years. When they finished, the garden looked almost like it had when my husband was alive. Not perfect, but cared for. Tended. I started going outside again, just for short walks at first, up and down the driveway, getting my strength back. Then longer ones, around the block, past houses I'd known for decades, and neighbors I'd watched grow old alongside me. Denise, the mail carrier, stopped to chat whenever she saw me. "Mrs. Brennan, looking good out here." "I'm trying," I told her, "one step at a time. That's all any of us can do." She was right, of course. That's all any of us can do. One step, then another, then another. You keep moving until the path becomes clear, or until you're too tired to move anymore. I wasn't tired yet. The case against Gerald moved through the system at its own pace. There were depositions, hearings, motions filed and responded to. Margaret handled most of it, shielding me from the worst of the legal back and forth. What I knew was this. Gerald had been offered a plea deal. He was considering it. If he took it, there would be no trial, just sentencing and restitution and whatever probation the judge deemed appropriate. "What do you want?" Margaret asked me one evening when we were reviewing documents at my kitchen table. "If it goes to trial, you'll have to testify. It'll be public. Harder on you." I thought about it. The idea of sitting in a courtroom telling strangers what my son had done to me. It made my stomach turn. But the alternative was letting him negotiate his way out, minimize what he'd done, claim it was all a misunderstanding between family members. I want the truth on record, I said finally. Whatever happens, I want it documented that he knew what he was doing, that it wasn't confusion or good intentions gone wrong. I spent 40 years making sure the truth got written down in courtrooms. I'm not going to stop now. Margaret nodded. Then we'll push for trial if he doesn't take a fair deal. Fair meaning what? Fair meaning he admits what he did. All of it. No spin, no excuses. Can you make that happen? She smiled. The sharp, wolfish smile I remembered from our days together in family court. Dottie, I've been practicing law for 35 years. I can make a lot of things happen. The phone call came on a Tuesday in May. I was in the garden, kneeling on a pad the landscapers had left behind, pulling weeds from around Frank's rose bushes. My knees ached, my back protested, but it felt good to have my hands in the soil again. Honest work. The kind that leaves dirt under your fingernails and sweat on your forehead. The phone rang inside the house. I thought about ignoring it. Probably a telemarketer or another reporter fishing for quotes about the Brennan case. But something made me stand, brush off my hands, and go inside. The voice on the other end was young, hesitant, familiar in a way that made my heart squeeze tight. Grandma? It's Emma. Emma, my youngest grandchild. The baby of the family. The last time I'd seen her, she was 14, all braces and awkward elbows and 2 long bangs she was always pushing out of her eyes. Emma, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. It's so good to hear from you. Silence on the line, then all in a rush. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, and I understand if you hang up, but I just needed to tell you that I don't believe what Dad's been saying about you. I never did, and I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I was scared, but Madison showed me the court documents and I read everything and— Emma, I interrupted gently. Breathe. A shaky inhale. Sorry, I'm rambling. I didn't know what was happening. Dad never told us anything real. He just said you were confused and making trouble, and that we should stay out of it. But I knew something was wrong. The way he talked about your house, like it was already his. The way Mom was always complaining about how much you cost them. I knew. You were a child, I said. It wasn't your responsibility to know. I'm not a child anymore. I'm 17. I can make my own decisions. 17. Almost the same age I was when I left my parents' house and started my own life, certain I knew everything and terrified I knew nothing. Yes, I agreed. You can. Madison wants to come see you. Tyler's still figuring things out, but he's not on Dad's side either. We've been talking, the 3 of us. We want to know you. The real you, not the version Dad made up. My hand was shaking where it held the phone. Not from age, not from weakness. From something else. Hope, maybe. That stupid, stubborn thing that never quite dies no matter how many times it gets beaten down. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that very much. They came the following Sunday. Madison drove. A sensible sedan she'd bought herself with money from a part-time job. Emma sat in the back, bouncing with nervous energy. They pulled into my driveway at noon, and I watched them from the window for a moment before going to the door. They looked so grown up. Madison had her father's height, but her mother's coloring, dark hair and pale skin, and sharp, assessing eyes. Emma was smaller, rounder, with glasses she kept pushing up her nose and a smile that reminded me painfully of Frank. Grandma, Madison said when I opened the door. She hesitated on the threshold, uncertain. Is it okay that we came? Come in, I said. Both of you, I made lunch. They followed me to the kitchen, looking around like they'd never seen the place before. Maybe they hadn't, not really. Their visits had always been so brief, so controlled. Gerald and Maureen herding them in and out, never letting them linger, never letting them see anything their parents didn't want them to see. I'd made sandwiches and lemonade, simple food that wouldn't intimidate anyone. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once taught Gerald to do his homework. And for a long moment, nobody said anything. Then Emma reached across the table and touched my hand. I'm sorry, she said, for not calling, for not knowing, for everything. You didn't do anything wrong, I told her. Your father made choices. Those choices weren't your fault. But I believed him. For a while anyway. When I was younger, I thought... She swallowed. I thought maybe you really were confused. Maybe you really did need to be taken care of. Because that's what he said. And he was my dad. And I didn't know how to not believe him. Madison nodded. We both did. Tyler, too, though he won't admit it yet. Dad had this way of making everything sound reasonable, like he was just doing what was best. Your father is very good at making things sound reasonable, I agreed. He's been practicing his whole life. Will he go to jail? Emma asked, small-voiced. I looked at my granddaughter, at her anxious eyes and trembling mouth, and I told her the truth. I don't know. Maybe. There's a plea deal being negotiated. If he takes it, if he admits what he did, there might be probation instead. Community service. Restitution. I paused. Do you want him to go to jail? Emma shook her head slowly. No. I don't know. He's my dad. But he did a terrible thing to you. A lot of terrible things. I don't know how to feel both of those at the same time. You don't have to figure it out today, I said. Or tomorrow. Feelings don't come with instruction manuals. They just come. You deal with them as best you can. Madison had been quiet, watching me with those assessing eyes so like her father's. How do you do it? She asked finally. How do you not hate him? I considered the question carefully before answering. I spent a lot of years angry at your father, not just for the money or the manipulation, but for the years he wasted, his and mine. I kept waiting for him to become the person I knew he could be, and he kept choosing not to. That's a hard thing to watch, a hard thing to accept. But you don't hate him? Hate takes too much energy, I said. I'm 77. I don't have energy to waste on hate anymore. What I have is clarity. I see your father for who he is now, not who I wished he was, not who I raised him to be, who he actually is. And I've made peace with the fact that I can't change him. I can only change how I respond. Madison nodded slowly. Something in her face shifted. Understanding, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Can we come back? Emma asked. Not just today. Can we be in your life? Even if Dad... You're always welcome here, I said. Both of you. Tyler too, when he's ready. You're my grandchildren. That doesn't change because your father made bad choices. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She pushed back her chair and came around the table to hug me, her thin arms tight around my shoulders, her face buried against my neck. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not giving up. I held her and stroked her hair, the way I'd held Gerald when he was small, the way I'd held Frank through all our years together. my family, what was left of it. I never gave up, I said. I just finally started fighting for myself. Gerald took the plea deal in June. I wasn't there for the hearing. Margaret advised against it, and I agreed. Whatever satisfaction I might have gotten from watching my son stand before a judge and admit what he'd done, it wasn't worth the cost. The stress, the attention, the reporters who'd been circling the case like vultures since it became public. But I read the transcript afterward. Every word. Gerald pled guilty to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He admitted to the transfers, the forged documents, the mail forwarding scheme. He admitted that he had known I was mentally competent, that his claims about my confusion were fabricated, that his entire plan had been designed to strip me of my assets while I was still alive and aware. The judge sentenced him to 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution. The restitution part was largely symbolic. Gerald didn't have $300,000 to pay back, and probably never would. His career was ruined. His marriage was over. His children weren't speaking to him. He'd lost everything, and he had no one to blame but himself. Margaret called me after the hearing. "It's done," she said. "He's officially on record as a convicted felon. No hiding from it now." "Good," I said. "You sound tired." "I am tired, but it's a good kind of tired. The kind that comes from finishing something you should have started years ago." She laughed softly. "You did good, Dottie. Really good. I'm proud of you. You did most of the work." "I did the legal work. You did the hard part, deciding you were worth fighting for. Most people never figure that out, not at any age." After I hung up, I sat in my chair by the window and watched the evening light slant across the garden. The roses were blooming now, red and pink and yellow, the colors Frank had chosen all those years ago. He'd said he wanted a garden that looked like a sunset. I thought he'd managed it. My house, my garden, my life, small and quiet, and entirely my own. Tomorrow I would call Tyler, try to reach him the way Emma and Madison had reached me. Tomorrow I would start planning for the future. Whatever future a 77-year-old woman with a complicated past could expect. Tonight, I just sat and breathed and let myself be grateful for what I had left. Summer stretched long and slow. I fell into a routine, the way you do when you're old and alone and have to make meaning out of ordinary days. Breakfast at 7, coffee and toast, and the morning paper I still had delivered because I liked the feel of newsprint in my hands. Garden work when the weather was good. Reading in the afternoon, books from the library I'd been meaning to get to for years. Dinner at 6, usually something simple. Soup, salad, whatever was fresh at the market. The grandchildren visited when they could. Madison drove down from college every few weeks, always with Emma in tow. Tyler finally called in August, awkward and halting, not quite ready to visit, but willing to talk. We took it slow. There was no rush. I didn't hear from Gerald. Margaret had filed a no-contact order as part of the legal proceedings, which meant he couldn't reach out to me directly even if he wanted to. Whether he wanted to, I didn't know. I tried not to think about it too much. The truth was, I missed him. Not the man he'd become, the one who'd lied and stolen and tried to lock me away, but the boy. The little boy who brought me dandelions and called them roses. The toddler who fell asleep in my arms, trusting me completely. The young man who used to call just to talk, before money got involved, before everything went sour. That boy was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed, except in my memories. But I missed him anyway. You don't stop loving your child just because they hurt you. You just learn to love them from farther away. On the anniversary of Frank's death, I drove to the cemetery. I don't drive much anymore. My reflexes aren't what they used to be, and the world moves too fast for a woman my age. But some trips require the effort. Some places you have to visit yourself. Frank's grave was simple, the way he'd wanted. Just a stone with his name and dates, and below that, the inscription I'd chosen. He built things that lasted. It had seemed important at the time, a way of saying who he was in a few words. I sat on the bench the cemetery provided, looking at my husband's name carved in granite. I did it, I told him, the way I'd told him so many times in my head. I stood up for myself. I saved the house. I kept my independence, just like you told me to. The wind rustled through the trees. A bird called somewhere nearby. I wish you could see the grandchildren, I continued. Emma looks just like you did in that picture from 1965. Same smile. Same way of holding her head when she's thinking. Madison has your stubbornness, which I mean as a compliment. Tyler's coming around, slowly. He's got his father's pride, but I think there's more of you in him than Gerald ever had. I paused, watching a squirrel race across the grass between the headstones. I don't know what we did wrong, I admitted. With Gerald, I've been over it 1,000 times. Were we too easy on him? Too hard? Did we give him too much or not enough? I don't know. Maybe some people just grow up hungry no matter how much you feed them. Maybe it wasn't our fault at all. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant rain. I'm not angry anymore, I said. I thought I'd be angry forever, but I'm not. I'm just sad. Sad for him, sad for us, sad for all the years we could have had if he'd just been different. But I can't make him different. I never could. I stood up, my knees protesting the movement, and touched the top of Frank's headstone. I miss you every day, I said, but I'm okay. I'm finally okay. The drive home was quiet. The sky stayed gray but held its rain. I pulled into my driveway as the afternoon faded toward evening, and for a moment I just sat in the car, looking at my house. It was an ordinary house. White siding, green shutters, a porch that needed repainting. Not grand, not impressive. Just a place where a family had lived, where children had grown up and grown away, where an old woman now rattled around in rooms that had once been full. But it was mine. That was the point. It was mine, and I had fought to keep it, and nobody would ever take it from me again. I got out of the car, walked up the steps, unlocked the door. The smell of home wrapped around me like always. I hung my keys on the hook by the door, set my purse on the hall table, went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. Ordinary things. Small things. The things that make up a life. Now, if you've read this far, and I can't imagine why you would, it's just the story of one old woman and her disappointing son. Let me say something to you directly. You might be sitting in your own house right now, looking at your own children, wondering if they see you the way Gerald saw me, as a burden, an obligation, a bank account with a pulse. You might be noticing small things, questions about your finances, comments about your house being too much for you, suggestions that you should let them handle the paperwork you've always managed yourself. Maybe you're telling yourself you're imagining things. Maybe you're telling yourself your child would never betray you. Not really. Not like those other people's children. You love them. You raised them. Surely that means something. It does mean something. It just doesn't mean they can't hurt you. I'm not saying your children are like Gerald. Most aren't. Most people grow up and move on and treat their aging parents with the care they deserve. But some don't. And if you're seeing the signs, if your mail is disappearing, if your accounts are shrinking, if someone keeps asking you to sign things you don't fully understand, please pay attention. Read the papers. Ask questions. Call a lawyer, even if it feels disloyal, even if your family tells you it's unnecessary. Talk to someone outside the situation, a friend, a neighbor, a doctor who knows you well enough to notice if something's wrong. Your love for your children doesn't have to mean losing yourself. It took me too long to learn that. I nearly lost everything because I couldn't believe my own son would betray me. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're locked in a room with papers you don't understand and a nurse shaking her head behind your back. And if this story sounds familiar, if you've been where I've been, or if you're there now, I want to hear from you. Not because comparing scars makes anything better, just because knowing you're not alone helps. It helped me when Margaret and Patrice and Denise showed me that people were watching out for me, even when I didn't know it. We watch out for each other. That's what we do. That's what keeps us human. I'm 78 now. My birthday came and went in February, quiet and unremarkable. Madison brought a cake. Emma wrote me a poem, sweet and clumsy and earnest. Tyler sent flowers, which I think was his way of apologizing for still not being ready to visit in person. I sat on my porch that evening, wrapped in a blanket Frank gave me years ago, watching the sun go down over the neighborhood where I've lived most of my adult life. The air smelled like snow coming, that sharp, clean scent that means winter isn't quite done with you yet. My house stood solid behind me, its walls holding everything I had left. My garden slept beneath the frost, waiting for spring. My life continued, small and ordinary and entirely my own. And somewhere out there, in a rented apartment, or a halfway house, or wherever disgraced sons go to rebuild themselves, Gerald was learning to live with what he'd done. I hoped he was learning. I hoped, stupidly, that he would someday become the man I'd always wanted him to be. But his journey wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd carried him long enough. It was time to let him walk on his own. I finished my tea as the last light faded. Then I went inside, locked the door behind me, and settled into my chair by the window. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. I would handle it, the way I'd handled everything else, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one small act of dignity after another. That's all any of us can do. That's all I've ever done. And if I'm the only one who's been through this, if my story is stranger than most, more painful, more unlikely, then at least I know I'm not crazy. I survived. I kept my house, my savings, my self-respect. I found family where I least expected it and lost it where I trusted it most. But if I'm not the only one, if you're out there reading this and nodding along, recognizing pieces of your own story in mine, then please, tell me. Leave a word. Let me know I'm not alone in this, the way Patrice's silent headshake told me I wasn't alone in that administrator's office. We're stronger than they think we are, you and I. We've lived too long and seen too much to be fooled forever. And when we finally stand up, when we finally say enough, when we finally fight back, there's nothing in this world that can stop us. I'm living proof of that.
Dorothy played him like a pro. She lost a son, but she kept her home and her peace of mind. Thanks for hanging out with me today. You guys are amazing. You know, I was thinking about this. Some people might say she should have just kicked him out the moment he brought those papers. But honestly, I think her way was way more savage. Letting him think he won while she was moving all the money behind his back? That's next level. It's sad she had to go to war with her own son, but he clearly deserved it. What do you think? Was this quiet revenge the right way to handle a snake? Or should she have just called the cops immediately? Hit that like button if you're on Team Dorothy. See you in the next one.